My name is Emery Calloway, and I used to believe that blood meant something. That the people who shared your last name would never be the ones to burn your house down. I was 28 years old when I learned how wrong I was, and it took me 4 more years to make every single one of them pay for it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it actually started. Not with the funeral, not with the will, but with a Tuesday afternoon in October when I still thought my life was mine. I grew up on Callaway Orchards, 130 acres of pecan trees outside Statesboro, Georgia, land that had belonged to my family since 1887. My great-great-grandfather planted the first grove with his own hands after buying the property from a man who thought pecans were a fool's crop. 4 generations later, we shipped nuts to specialty grocers in 6 states and ran a farm store that tourists stopped at on their way to Savannah. My father, Walton Callaway, built most of that success himself. He was a hard man, the kind who measured love in acreage and work ethic, but he loved that land the way other men love their children. And in a strange way, he loved me the same way, because I was the one who stayed. My mother died when I was 9. Ovarian cancer, fast and merciless, gone in 11 months. After that it was just Daddy and me for 6 years, until he married Denise. I want to be fair here because fairness matters to me, even now, even after everything. Denise wasn't cruel when she first came into our lives. She was warm, in the practiced way of a woman who'd spent her whole life learning how to be liked. She brought a son with her, Trip, 2 years older than me, a boy with his mother's smile and absolutely nothing behind his eyes. I didn't hate either of them at first. I just didn't understand why my father needed them so badly. By the time I was 22, I had a horticulture degree from the University of Georgia, and I'd turned down 2 job offers in Atlanta to come home and run the orchard's expansion into value-added products. Pecan oils, brittle, a line of pies we sold through a distributor in Charleston. I was good at it. Within 3 years I'd grown that side of the business from nothing to nearly 40% of our annual revenue. Daddy used to introduce me at the co-op meetings as my daughter, the one with the head for business, and I lived for that sentence like it was oxygen. Trip, meanwhile, drifted. 2 failed attempts at community college, a car dealership job he lost for reasons nobody explained to me, a stint helping with farm equipment sales that mostly involved him disappearing for long lunches. Denise defended him constantly. Every family has a version of this arithmetic. The child who is praised for trying and the child who is praised for succeeding, and somehow the second child always ends up doing more work for less credit. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself Daddy could see the difference even if he never said it out loud. I was wrong about that too. My father had his first heart attack in March, the year I turned 27. Mild, the doctors said, a warning shot. He recovered, cut back on fried food he never actually stopped eating, and went back to work within 6 weeks like nothing had happened. I should have paid closer attention. I should have asked more questions about who was driving him to his cardiology appointments, because it wasn't me. Denise had started handling all that for him, she said, so I could focus on the business. I thought that was generous of her. It wasn't generous. It was access. By August of that year, my father was a different man in ways I only pieced together afterward. He stopped coming to the Tuesday operations meetings. He started deferring to Denise on decisions that used to be entirely his. Which fertilizer supplier to use, whether to renew the lease on the North 40. Small things at first. Things I chalked up to a man slowing down after a health scare. I was so focused on harvest projections and a new contract with a Whole Foods regional buyer that I didn't notice my father was being quietly, methodically walled off from his own life. The second heart attack killed him in October. He was 61. I found out because Denise called me while I was standing in the processing barn with pecan dust on my hands, and her voice on the phone was so calm, so controlled, that for one disorienting second I thought she was calling about something else entirely. Then she said the words, and the barn tilted sideways, and I don't remember driving to the hospital. I just remember standing in a hallway that smelled like antiseptic and hand sanitizer, watching Denise sob into Trip's shoulder while I stood 3 feet away with nobody's arms around me at all. That's the moment I should have understood something about my place in that family. I didn't. Grief makes you stupid. It makes you cling to the story you've always told yourself, even when the world is already rewriting it without your permission. The funeral was on a Thursday. 300 people came, farmers, church members, the mayor of Statesboro, men who'd known my father since they were boys hunting quail together. I stood at the front of the sanctuary in a black dress that used to be my mother's, and I gave the eulogy because Denise said she couldn't possibly, and Tripp said he wasn't good with words. I talked about the orchard, about how my father used to walk the rows at dawn before anyone else was awake, checking each tree like he was counting his own children. People cried. Denise cried loudest of all in the front pew, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief that never seemed to actually get wet. I didn't think about that detail until much later. At the time, I just thought she was devastated, same as me. The will reading happened 11 days after the funeral, in the office of a lawyer named Preston Hale, a soft-spoken man in his 60s who'd handled Calloway family business since before I was born. I sat in a leather chair across from his desk with Denise on one side of me and Tripp on the other, and I remember feeling, for one brief and foolish moment, like we were a family united in loss. Preston cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and started reading. The orchard, all 130 acres, the farm store, the processing facility, the brand, was to be divided. 60% to me, 40% to Denise, with provisions for Tripp to receive a modest cash inheritance and no ownership stake, given his lack of involvement in daily operations. That had been the will my father signed 3 years earlier, back when he still trusted his own judgment, back when Denise hadn't yet learned how to make herself indispensable to a dying man's paperwork. Except that wasn't the will Preston Hale read to us that day. The will he read gave Denise 70% ownership and full operational control. It gave Tripp a management position with a salary and title, Chief Operations Officer, a job that did not exist 11 days earlier. It gave me 30%, non-voting, with a clause stating that any attempt to challenge the distribution or interfere with Denise's management decisions would trigger a forfeiture provision reducing my share to 5%. The date on the new will was 4 months before my father died. 4 months into whatever fog Denise had built around him after that first heart attack. I remember the sound in that room going strange, tinny, like I was hearing it underwater. I remember asking Preston to read it again, and he did in the same gentle, apologetic voice, and I remember looking at Denise's face and seeing something there I had never let myself see before. Not grief, not even relief, but calculation. Cold, patient calculation. Like a woman watching a hand of cards, she'd known she was going to win before she ever sat down at the table. "Daddy would never do this," I said. My voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. "Your father," Denise said, and her voice had changed too, shed its warmth like a coat she no longer needed. "Made a lot of decisions in his final months that maybe you weren't paying close enough attention to. He was worried about you, Emery. About your temper. About some of the choices you'd been making." I didn't understand what she meant. Not yet. That understanding would come 3 weeks later, in the ugliest way possible, and by then it would already be too late to stop what she'd built. I want to tell you that I fought back immediately, that I marched into a lawyer's office the next morning with fire in my eyes. That's not what happened. What happened is that grief and shock and disbelief kept me paralyzed for almost a month, going through the motions of running the harvest, sleeping 4 hours a night, replaying every conversation with my father from the last year of his life, searching for the moment I should have noticed something was wrong. I kept thinking, he wouldn't do this to me. I kept thinking, there has to be an explanation. That's the particular cruelty of losing a parent to manipulation instead of just death. You don't just grieve the person, you grieve the version of the relationship you thought you had, and you have to do it while the people who stole it from you are still standing right in front of you, wearing his last name like a mask. The first real crack came in November, when I noticed the farm's checking account was short almost $18,000 from what our fall projections should have shown. I brought it up at what used to be our Tuesday meeting. Now a meeting Denise ran from the head of the table my father used to sit at, and she told me, with a patience that felt performed for an audience of exactly one, that she'd authorized a consulting contract with a business strategist to help modernize our operations. The strategist's name was Cole Bishop. I didn't know it yet, but Cole Bishop was Denise's boyfriend, a man she'd been seeing since at least February, for months before that second will was signed, and the $18,000 was the first of what would become a much larger and much more deliberate drain on the company my great-great-grandfather built with his own 2 hands. I started keeping records after that. Quietly. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing, not even my best friend Naomi, who ran the farm store, and who I trusted more than almost anyone alive. I just started photographing invoices, saving emails, noting dates and amounts in a notebook I kept locked in my truck's glove compartment because some instinct, some animal sense of danger, told me not to keep it anywhere in the house. That instinct saved everything that came after. If I'd kept that notebook at home, I have no doubt Denise would have found a way to make it disappear. The same way she made so many other things disappear that fall. The forfeiture clause hung over every conversation like a blade. 30% non-voting was already a joke, a number designed to keep me quiet while looking generous on paper, but 5% was a number designed to erase me. So I didn't challenge anything directly. I smiled. I nodded. I told myself I was gathering evidence, building a case, being patient the way my father taught me to be patient with a difficult harvest season. What I didn't yet know was that patience was exactly what Denise was counting on. Because while I was quietly documenting invoices, she was quietly building something far more dangerous. A story. A story about me. It started as whispers I wasn't supposed to hear. Naomi caught wind of it first, in early December, when a woman from our church prayer circle asked her, with false sympathy dripping off every word, whether it was true that Emery had gotten into some trouble the year before. Naomi didn't know what she was talking about, because there was no trouble. There had never been any trouble. But the question kept surfacing in different forms from different people, until Naomi finally sat me down in the back office of the farm store and told me what she'd been hearing. The story going around Statesboro was that I'd had a substance abuse problem, pills specifically stemming from what people were calling the accident. Though there had never been an accident, not one involving me. The story said my father had been covering for me for years, paying for a rehab stint in Atlanta that never happened, that the reason he'd changed his will was that his lawyer and his family had convinced him I wasn't fit to run a business, that Denise had reluctantly taken on the burden of majority ownership, because someone responsible needed to protect what was left of the Calloway legacy from my instability. I sat in that back office and felt the floor of my entire life give way beneath me. Because here's the thing about a lie like that in a small town. It doesn't need to be true. It just needs to be plausible and repeatable, and delivered by someone with a widow's grief and a stepmother's concern written all over her face. Denise had spent 6 years building a reputation as the warm, devoted second wife who'd given up her own life in Macon to move to Statesboro and support my father. She had standing in that community that I, the quiet, work-focused daughter, who spent more time with pecan trees than with people, simply did not have. When she started telling that story, carefully in private conversations, always framed as reluctant honesty rather than gossip, people believed her. Why wouldn't they? She was the grieving widow protecting her late husband's memory. I was just the daughter who suddenly seemed a little too angry, a little too intense, whenever anyone brought up the will. That was the second thing I understood too late. Denise wasn't just stealing my inheritance. She was preloading the explanation for why I might eventually snap and say something that sounded unstable, so that when I finally did fight back, and she had to know I eventually would, I would already look exactly like the daughter she'd described. She was building a trap disguised as a narrative, and I was walking into it one furious, grief-stricken day at a time. I found out how far she'd taken it on a Sunday in mid-December, 3 days before the harvest season officially closed. I'd driven into town for supplies and stopped at the diner on Main Street, the one my father used to take me to every Saturday morning when I was small, and I overheard 2 women in the booth behind me talking about poor Denise and everything she'd been through with that girl. One of them mentioned, in a hushed voice clearly meant to sound discreet, and instead carrying across the entire diner, that Denise was reportedly considering having me evaluated. That word, evaluated, like I was a piece of farm equipment with a mechanical fault, because she was worried about my mental state after Daddy's death. I sat in my truck in the diner parking lot for 45 minutes after that, hands shaking on the steering wheel, and I made a decision that changed the entire rest of my life. I stopped being patient. I drove straight to Preston Hale's office without an appointment, and when his secretary told me he was in a meeting, I told her I would wait in the parking lot until he wasn't. 2 hours later, Preston came out to find me sitting on the hood of my truck, and something in my face must have told him this wasn't a conversation that could wait, because he brought me inside and closed the door. "I need you to tell me something," I said, "and I need you to tell me the truth, because you've known my family for 30 years and I think some part of you already knows something is wrong. When my father signed that new will, for months before he died, did you draft it?" Preston was quiet for a long moment. Then he told me something that confirmed every fear I'd been too afraid to say out loud. He hadn't drafted it. A different attorney had, a man named Garrett Voss who worked out of Savannah, and who Preston had never heard of before that crossed his desk for the estate filing. Preston had assumed, at the time, that my father had simply chosen to use a different lawyer for personal reasons, and it hadn't been his place to question a client's private decisions. But he admitted, carefully, choosing each word like he was diffusing something, that the signature on that will didn't look quite like the Walton Calloway signature he'd been seeing on documents for 3 decades. Slightly different pressure. Slightly different slant. He hadn't said anything at the time because it wasn't his place, and because questioning a dead man's will based on a hunch about penmanship would have opened a legal can of worms he had no standing to open. But now, sitting across from me, watching me hold myself together by sheer force of will, he said something I will never forget. "Emery, if you're asking me whether I think somebody took advantage of your father while he was sick and scared and easy to manage, I think you already know what I believe. But believing something and proving it are 2 very different mountains to climb, and you're going to need more than my hunches to climb the second one." I left his office that afternoon with exactly one thing I didn't have before: permission to stop doubting myself. And I drove home already building, in my mind, the outline of everything I was going to do next, though it would take me the better part of a year. A forensic accountant named Priya Deshmukh, a handwriting expert, a private investigator with a talent for finding exactly the kind of digital trail people think they've deleted, and one devastating conversation with my father's cardiologist to finally understand the full shape of what Denise and Tripp and Cole Bishop had done to my family. I didn't sleep that night, or the one after it. I lay in my childhood bedroom. I'd moved back into the main house after Daddy died, because Denise had asked me to, in a voice so reasonable it made my skin crawl in retrospect, and because some pathetic, grieving part of me had wanted to stay close to the rooms where he'd lived, and I made a list on the back of a feed store receipt. Not a to-do list. A list of questions. Who drafted the second will? Who witnessed it? Where the $18,000 actually went? Who Cole Bishop really was? Why my father, a man who never once in his life let anyone rush him into a decision about the farm, had apparently rewritten his entire legacy in a matter of weeks. By the second morning, I understood something important. I couldn't answer any of those questions from inside that house. Not with Denise walking the halls in her silk robe, humming to herself like a woman who'd already won. I needed people who didn't know my name, didn't care about the Calloway reputation, and had no stake in whether I looked crazy or credible to the town of Statesboro. I started with Priya Deshmukh. I found her through a referral from a college friend who worked in agricultural finance in Atlanta, a forensic accountant, she told me, someone who specialized in exactly this kind of situation, family businesses where the money trail got murky right around the time somebody died. Priya was maybe 40, sharp-eyed, unhurried in a way that made me feel unhurried too, which I badly needed. I drove 2 hours to her office in Atlanta with a banker's box full of photographed invoices, bank statements I'd pulled from an old joint account my father had never bothered closing after I turned 18, and the notebook from my glove compartment. She spent the first 20 minutes just flipping through pages without saying anything, and I sat there with my hands folded in my lap like I was back in Sunday school, waiting to be judged. "Okay," she finally said. "I'm going to tell you what I see, and then I'm going to tell you what I don't see yet, and the second part is more important than the first." What she saw: a pattern of payments to something called Bishop Strategic Consulting LLC, starting in July, 3 months before my father died, 1 month before the mysterious will was signed, totaling, by the time of his death, just over $61,000. What she didn't see yet: any actual consulting work. No reports. No deliverables. No emails describing strategy sessions. Just invoices, vague to the point of meaninglessness, each one signed off by Denise. "This is either the laziest fraud I've ever seen," Priya said, "or somebody was moving fast and didn't think anyone would ever look closely. Money like this, done by someone patient, gets laundered through 3 or 4 shell layers before it lands anywhere useful. This didn't. This is a woman who thought the game was already over." I asked her the question that had been eating me alive since the diner parking lot. "Can you prove where it went after that? After it left the farm's account?" She could try. She'd need bank records for Bishop Strategic Consulting, which meant either a subpoena, which meant a lawsuit, which meant tipping my hand to Denise before I was ready, or a different kind of digging. That's when Priya gave me the name of a private investigator she'd worked with before, a man named Doyle Rennick, who specialized, in her words, in finding the parts of people's lives that they'd prefer stayed buried, using entirely legal methods, which is more of an art than you'd think. Doyle Rennick looked nothing like what I expected. I'd pictured someone out of a television show, all trench coat and cigarette smoke. What I got was a soft-spoken man in his 50s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a cardigan that made him look like a substitute teacher. He ran a 2-person operation out of a strip mall office in Augusta, and within our first 15 minutes together, he'd already pulled up public records, showing that Cole Bishop had no business license for Bishop Strategic Consulting LLC in the state of Georgia. The LLC existed on paper, filed in Delaware 6 months before he started dating my stepmother, filed, in fact, exactly 2 weeks after his previous business, a used car financing operation in Macon, had been sued into bankruptcy by 11 separate creditors. Your stepmother's boyfriend, Doyle told me, sliding a folder across his desk, has done this before. Different names, different women, same shape every time. He finds somebody with money or access to money. A widow, usually somebody grieving and lonely and eager to feel taken care of, and he becomes indispensable to her. Sometimes it's romance. Sometimes it's just friendship that turns financial. He's not flashy about it. He's patient. That's what makes him dangerous. I asked how he knew all this so fast. Because I've seen his face before, Doyle said. Different name back then, went by Cole Bishara for a stretch in Florida, before that Cole Bristow in Alabama. Same man. I did a background check on him 4 years ago for a woman in Valdosta who wanted to know why her mother's retirement account had shrunk by 60% after this fella showed up in her life. Never got hired to finish that job. The mother wouldn't hear a word against him, kicked her own daughter out of the house over it. I never forget a face like that. Men who do this for a living have a particular kind of stillness to them. Like they're always watching you figure out how useful you are. I sat in that strip mall office with my hands pressed flat against my knees, trying to hold myself together, because the picture forming in front of me was worse than theft. It was architecture. Someone had built a structure specifically designed to collapse onto my family, and Denise hadn't been an unwitting victim of a con man's charm. She'd been his partner, feeding him access, feeding him my father's trust, feeding him, eventually, $61,000 of Callaway Orchard's operating budget disguised as consulting fees for advice nobody could produce a single page of. But knowing that, and proving it in a way that would hold up against a will already filed with the probate court, were 2 very different mountains to climb, exactly like Preston Hale had warned me. The handwriting was next. Preston gave me the name of a forensic document examiner he'd used once before, decades earlier, in a contested estate case. A retired FBI document analyst named Ruth Okafor, who now consulted privately out of Charlotte. I mailed her copies of my father's signature from 11 different documents spanning 15 years, deeds, contracts, an old hunting license, a letter he'd written me my freshman year of college that I'd kept folded in my desk drawer since I was 18, alongside a certified copy of the signature on the contested will. 3 weeks later, her report arrived in a manila envelope, and I read it standing in my truck in the farm store parking lot because I couldn't wait until I got inside. Ruth's conclusion, in careful, hedged forensic language, was that the signature on the contested will showed significant inconsistencies in stroke pressure, letter formation, and baseline alignment when compared against the exemplar signatures provided, and that in her professional opinion, the probability that this signature was produced by the same hand as the exemplars was low. She was careful not to say forgery outright. That wasn't her job, she explained in a follow-up phone call. Her job was to describe what the evidence showed and let a court decide what it meant. But she also told me something that made my stomach drop clean through the floor of my truck. Ms. Calloway, I want to be honest with you about something I noticed that isn't really in my area of expertise, but I've done this work for almost 30 years and you develop instincts. The tremor pattern in some of your father's later exemplar signatures, the ones from the months right before his death, those don't look like a man who's simply getting older or tired. If I were you, I'd want a doctor to look at those alongside his medical records. Something about the progression concerns me. That sentence sat in my chest for a week before I did anything about it, because I understood, with a dread I couldn't quite name yet, that Ruth Okafor was telling me my father might not have simply been manipulated in his final months. He might have been actively, chemically managed. I called Dr. Farid Osei, my father's cardiologist of 9 years, a man who'd sat with me in a hospital hallway the night Daddy died, and told me, with what I'd taken at the time for simple professional sympathy, that he was sorry, that Walton had fought hard. I asked him if I could come in and talk, not as a patient, but as a daughter with questions about her father's final months. He agreed, cautiously, and told me he'd need to review what he could share given medical privacy laws even after a patient's death, but that he'd do what he could. I sat across from Dr. Osei's desk 2 days later, and he pulled up my father's chart on his monitor, scrolling slowly, his brow furrowing in a way that made my pulse pick up before he'd said a single word. "Your father's cardiac medication regimen changed twice in his final 4 months," he said finally. "Once was a change I made myself, adjusting his beta-blocker dosage after a follow-up visit in July. The second change I did not make. There's a refill request in the pharmacy record from September for a significantly higher dosage of one of his sedating medications. Something we'd had him on at a low dose for anxiety following his first heart attack, and I have no record of authorizing that increase. I assumed, frankly, that it was a documentation error on the pharmacy's end. I'm going to be honest with you, Ms. Calloway, this is troubling me now that you're asking." I asked him, very carefully, keeping my voice as level as I could manage, whether a higher dose of that medication could have made my father more confused, more suggestible, more likely to sign something without fully understanding it, or to defer decisions to whoever was standing closest to him. Dr. Osei didn't answer that directly. He told me, gently but firmly, that he couldn't speculate about intent or causation without a much fuller review, and that this was now a conversation that needed to involve people with more authority than either of us. But he also told me he'd be willing to put his observations about the medication discrepancy in writing, and that if I was building some kind of legal case, I should get a medical malpractice attorney and possibly law enforcement involved, because an unauthorized increase in a controlled medication dosage was not a small thing. I drove home from that appointment and had to pull over twice because I couldn't see the road clearly through my own tears. Not just grief this time. Something closer to rage, a rage so total it felt almost peaceful, the way I imagine the eye of a hurricane must feel. A strange, terrible stillness at the center of something enormous. Because here is what I now understood, piece by piece. The way you understand a wound is worse than you thought only after the adrenaline wears off. Denise hadn't just waited for my father to die and then manipulated a grieving family into a bad will. She had, in all likelihood, kept him medicated into a fog for months, cut him off from the operational meetings and relationships that used to anchor him, brought in a professional con man to drain the business, and orchestrated a fraudulent will. All while performing devoted wifehood so convincingly that 300 people cried at his funeral believing she'd lost the love of her life. And then, when it was done, when the land and the money and the name were hers, she turned around and started telling the entire town of Statesboro that I was the unstable one. That I was the risk. That my father, God rest him, had been protecting the world from his own daughter. I did not go to the police immediately, and looking back, some people might judge me for that. But Doyle Rennick, who by that point I trusted more than almost anyone, told me something that stuck with me. "Emery, if you go to the sheriff's department right now with a suspicious handwriting report and a doctor's hunch about a pharmacy record, you'll get a case number and a pat on the head, and then you'll spend 18 months watching Denise Calloway shred documents and coach witnesses while the wheels turn slow enough to rust. You want this done right, you build the whole case first, quiet, complete, undeniable. Then you hand it to the law all at once, so tight there's no room for anybody to wiggle out." So that's what I did. For 4 months, through the dead of winter and into a cold Georgia spring, I lived a double life. In public, I was the same quiet, grieving daughter I'd always been, showing up to farm operations meetings, nodding along to Denise's decisions, letting her believe she'd successfully boxed me into the small, harmless 30% she thought I'd accept rather than risk the forfeiture clause. I even let word get back to her, through channels I knew would carry it, that I was seeing someone about my grief. True, actually, I had started seeing a therapist in Savannah, a woman named Dr. Callahan, who helped me stay upright through what might have otherwise broken me. Because I understood that Denise's whole narrative depended on people believing I was fragile, and a small, cold part of me decided to let her keep believing that right up until the moment it stopped being useful to her. Behind that quiet surface, though, Priya Deshmukh was pulling apart 6 years of Calloway Orchard's financial records with the patience of a surgeon, tracing not just the $61,000 to Cole Bishop's shell company, but a second, smaller, more insidious pattern. Payments to a property management firm that turned out to be registered to Denise's sister in Macon, siphoning off farm store revenue through a marketing services arrangement that had existed since almost the very beginning of Denise's marriage to my father. It wasn't just $61,000. By the time Priya finished her full audit, going back 3 years, the number was closer to $240,000, moved out of Calloway Orchards through 4 different arrangements, most of it while my father was alive and, for at least the first 2 years of it, likely unaware. That detail broke something in me, and healed something else at the same time. Because it meant my father hadn't been a fool his whole marriage. The theft had escalated dramatically only in his final year, which lined up almost exactly with when Cole Bishop entered the picture and the medication changes began. It meant that whatever else had gone wrong between us in his final months, my father had spent most of his marriage to Denise simply being a man who loved his second wife and trusted her, the way anyone might, and that the true betrayal had a start date, a moment where things had turned from an ordinary imperfect marriage into a calculated extraction plan. Understanding that didn't make the grief smaller, but it gave the grief a shape, and a shape is something you can eventually learn to carry. Doyle Rennick, meanwhile, kept digging into Cole Bishop and turned up something even more useful than his history of aliases. Bishop had a habit, it turned out, of documenting his own schemes, not out of carelessness but arrogance, the particular arrogance of a man who'd never once been caught and had stopped believing he ever would be. Doyle found, through a public records request tied to the Delaware LLC filing, a business email address Bishop had used for Bishop Strategic Consulting, and through a contact he wouldn't name, obtained entirely legally, he assured me twice, a set of emails between Bishop and Denise dated from that fateful summer. I read those emails alone in my truck, in the same parking lot where I'd read the handwriting report months earlier, and I had to stop twice to breathe. Denise had written, 5 weeks before the will was signed, that Walton was more manageable now that the doctor had bumped up his medication, that Garrett said they just needed him lucid enough to sign but calm enough not to ask too many questions, that it would only be 2 more weeks. Bishop had written back not to worry, that nobody questions a grieving family, that by the time she figured out what happened it would already be filed and finalized. There it was. Not a suspicion anymore. Not a hunch from a document examiner or a doctor's confused pharmacy record. Written proof, in Denise's own words, of a plan to keep my father sedated specifically to make him easier to manipulate, timed precisely around getting a fraudulent will signed. Garrett Voss, the Savannah attorney Preston Hale had never heard of before, wasn't an outside party stumbling into a family's private business. He was part of it. I sat with those printed emails for a long time before I called Doyle back. My hands were steady by then, which surprised me. I think I'd expected to feel shattered reading proof of exactly how deliberately I'd been betrayed, but instead I felt something click into place, like a bone being set. Grief had been the water I was drowning in for 5 months. Now I finally had solid ground. I want everything ready, I told Doyle. The financials, the handwriting report, the medical discrepancy, these emails. I want a lawyer who eats people like Emery Calloway for breakfast, and I want to know exactly which door to walk through first, probate court, criminal fraud, or the sheriff's department, so that by the time she realizes what's happening, there's nowhere left for her to run. Doyle smiled for the first time since I'd met him, a small, tired, satisfied smile. Now you're asking the right question, he said. Let me make some calls. The lawyer's name was Corinne Ashby, and she practiced out of Savannah, specializing in estate litigation and elder financial exploitation, a term I hadn't even known existed until Doyle used it, but which described, with clinical precision, exactly what had been done to my father. Corinne was maybe 50, silver-streaked hair pulled back in a way that made her look like she had absolutely no patience for nonsense, and within our first meeting she'd already sketched out a 3-pronged strategy. A probate court challenge to the will itself, based on the handwriting analysis and medical evidence of diminished capacity and possible chemical manipulation. A civil suit against Denise, Cole Bishop, and Garrett Voss for fraud and breach of fiduciary duty, seeking recovery of the $240,000 plus damages, and a referral to the Bullitt County Sheriff's Department and the Georgia Attorney General's Office for criminal investigation, given the evidence of what looked increasingly like elder abuse layered on top of the financial fraud. This is going to take time, Corinne told me. Court cases like this don't move fast, and Denise is going to fight you every step of the way, because she has to. The alternative is losing everything and possibly going to prison. She's also going to keep telling that story about you around town, probably louder, because desperate people get louder, not quieter. You need to be ready for that. Are you ready for that? I thought about the diner, about the women in the booth behind me, about poor Denise and the word evaluated hanging in the air like a threat. I thought about my father walking those pecan rows at dawn, counting his trees like children, and about the fact that somewhere in his final months, someone he trusted had been counting down the days until he was sedated enough to sign away everything he'd built. I've been ready since October, I said. I was just waiting until I couldn't lose. Corinne filed the initial probate challenge on the second Monday of April, and within 48 hours, the entire town of Statesboro knew something had shifted. Denise called me 11 times that first day. I didn't answer a single one. I let her calls go to voicemail while I sat in Preston Hale's office. Preston, who'd offered to formally step back into an advisory role once he learned what Corinne had uncovered, partly out of loyalty to my father and partly, I think, out of his own guilt for not pushing harder on his instincts about that signature months earlier, and together we began the process of formally notifying the probate court, the sheriff's department, and at Corinne's insistence, a reporter at the Savannah Morning News who covered local business and had coincidentally done a flattering profile on Calloway orchards 2 years earlier under my father's leadership. That last part was Corinne's idea, and it was, I'll admit, the part that scared me most. You've spent 6 months letting her control the narrative, Corinne said. Court documents become public record, but they don't read themselves to 300 church-going neighbors. If you want your name back, Emery, not just your land, your actual name, you're going to have to be willing to tell your own story before she gets the chance to tell it again first. I thought about that for 3 days before I agreed. And on a Thursday morning in late April, exactly 6 months and 1 day after my father's funeral, I sat down across from a reporter named Vanessa Trujillo in the back office of the farm store. The same office where Naomi had first told me what people were whispering. And for the first time since October, I stopped being quiet. Naomi came with me that morning, sitting just out of frame while Vanessa set a small recorder on the desk between us and asked if I was comfortable being recorded. I said yes. I remember my hands were steady, which still surprises me when I look back, because 6 months earlier I couldn't hold a coffee cup without it rattling against the saucer. Start wherever you want, Vanessa said. Take your time. So I did. I told her about my father walking the rows at dawn. I told her about the will reading, about the number that changed from 60 to 30 to 5, about the whispers that had started calling me unstable before I'd said a single public word in my own defense. I didn't accuse anyone of anything I couldn't prove. Corinne had drilled that into me for 3 straight days beforehand. Stick to what's documented, she'd told me. Let the paper trail do the accusing. You just tell the truth about what happened to you. So that's what I did. I told Vanessa about the handwriting report, careful to use Ruth Okafor's exact hedged language, significant inconsistencies, low probability of the same hand. I told her about Dr. Osei's unexplained medication increase, careful again to say only what he'd been willing to put in writing. I told her about the forensic accounting, the shell company in Delaware, the $240,000. I did not read her the emails between Denise and Cole Bishop out loud. Those were part of the sealed court filing, evidence for the criminal referral, not yet public, but I told her they existed, that investigators had them, and that I trusted the process now underway to make everything clear in time. What I didn't expect was how much it would cost me to say all of it out loud to a stranger with a recorder. By the time we finished 90 minutes later, I was hollowed out in a way that felt almost physical, like something had been carved out of my chest and set down on the desk between us next to that little recording device. Naomi drove me home. I didn't say a single word the whole way, and she didn't ask me to. The article ran the following Sunday, above the fold in the Savannah Morning News's regional section, under a headline about the family's Pecan business at the center of an elder exploitation investigation. Vanessa had done her job well, thorough, careful, quoting Corinne on the legal specifics, quoting Preston Hale on the changed signature, quoting Dr. Osei's measured, professional concern about the medication discrepancy. She'd reached out to Denise for comment and received a 2-sentence statement through an attorney denying any wrongdoing and expressing sympathy for a grieving stepdaughter's difficulty accepting her father's final wishes. That sentence made me laugh out loud when I first read it, a short, ugly laugh with no humor in it at all. Even now, cornered, she was still performing sympathy for the cameras. But something had shifted, and it shifted fast. Within days, the story had been picked up by a local television station out of Savannah, then a regional agricultural trade publication that had profiled the orchard years earlier under happier circumstances. People who'd spent 6 months whispering about my supposed instability suddenly had a very different, very public document to reckon with. Not gossip anymore, but a forensic document examiner's report and a cardiologist's sworn concern, laid out in black and white for anyone to read. Naomi told me later that the mood at the farm store changed within a single week. Customers who'd been distant, awkward, unsure how to greet me since the funeral started coming up to her at the register and asking, quietly, if I was doing all right. Women from the same prayer circle that had spread Denise's story in the first place started calling to apologize, some of them, for repeating things they now understood weren't true. I didn't take much satisfaction in that, honestly. It felt less like vindication and more like watching a fever finally break in a patient who'd been sick a very long time. Relief, mostly, and a tired kind of grief for all the months I'd spent being quietly disbelieved by people who'd known me my whole life. Denise, for her part, went silent in public and loud in private. She called my phone until I blocked her number, then called Naomi's, then called Preston Hale's office directly, demanding to know why he'd turned against the family after 30 years of loyal service. Preston, to his credit, told her exactly what he'd told me, that his loyalty had always been to the truth of what Walton Calloway actually wanted, and that if she had nothing to hide, she had nothing to fear from a fair investigation. She hung up on him. Tripp reached out to me exactly once during that period, a text message that arrived at 11 at night, 3 days after the article ran, telling me this was really messed up, that his mom didn't do any of this, that I was destroying our family over money. I stared at that message for a long time before I typed back a single line. That I wasn't the one who destroyed our family, that I was just the one finally telling the truth about it. He never responded, and I never heard from him again except through lawyers. The criminal investigation moved faster than Corinne had warned me it might, mostly, I think, because the Bullock County Sheriff's Department didn't want to be seen dragging its feet on a case that had already made regional news, and because the Georgia Attorney General's office had recently created a dedicated elder financial exploitation unit that was, according to Corinne, actively looking for a strong case to establish its credibility. Ours, unfortunately for Denise, was about as strong as they come: documented financial fraud, a forensic handwriting analysis, sworn medical testimony, and a set of emails that read like a confession written by two people who never imagined anyone would find them. Investigators executed a search warrant on Denise's home computer and Cole Bishop's apartment in Savannah in early May. I wasn't there, obviously, but Doyle Rennick, who by that point had become something between a professional ally and an unlikely friend, called me that evening with an update he'd pieced together from a contact in the sheriff's department. They'd found more emails, more financial records, a second shell company Priya's audit hadn't caught, this one funneling money through a fake agricultural equipment leasing arrangement that had been draining nearly $4,000 a month from the farm's operating account since the year before my father's first heart attack. Meaning the theft had started even earlier than we'd realized, back when my father was still healthy, still sharp, still fully capable of catching it himself, if anyone had thought to look. That detail haunted me for weeks. It meant Denise had been stealing from my father while he was still perfectly capable of noticing, betting, correctly for years, that his trust in her ran deep enough that he'd never think to check. Garrett Voss, the attorney who'd drafted the fraudulent will, turned out to be the investigation's most useful break. Faced with the emails, faced with a state bar ethics complaint Corinne had filed the same week as the probate challenge, faced with the very real possibility of disbarment and criminal charges for his role in drafting a will he had every reason to believe was the product of undue influence and diminished capacity, Voss's own attorney reached out to the district attorney's office in late May with an offer to cooperate in exchange for leniency. He gave a full statement. He described in detail a meeting at Denise's house in September, 1 month before my father died, where Denise and Cole Bishop had walked him through exactly what they needed the new will to say, and where he'd asked, he claimed, whether Walton fully understood what he was signing, and Denise had assured him that of course he did. He was just tired, he'd had a long day, they'd walk him through it slowly. Voss's statement also confirmed something Doyle's stolen emails had only hinted at, that the plan had originally called for cutting me out almost entirely, and that the modest 30% I'd been left with had been Denise's idea specifically, a calculated kindness meant to make the will look less suspicious to outside eyes. Give the daughter something, she'd apparently said, so it doesn't look like we cut her out completely. Nobody investigates a will that looks generous. I remember reading that particular detail and feeling something curdle in my stomach. Even my 30%, the number I'd spent months quietly enduring, telling myself at least it wasn't nothing, had been a calculated piece of set dressing, designed to make her theft look more plausible to anyone who might ask questions. I hadn't been shown mercy. I'd been used as camouflage. The probate court ruling came first, in late June, 8 months after my father's death. Judge Marion Whitfield, a woman with a reputation, according to Corinne, for having very little patience for what she called deathbed surprises, reviewed the handwriting analysis, the medical testimony, and Garrett Voss's sworn statement, and ruled that the contested will was invalid due to lack of testamentary capacity and undue influence, reinstating the original will my father had signed 3 years earlier. The one giving me 60% ownership of Calloway Orchards and Denise 40%. With no ownership stake for Tripp, I sat in that courtroom between Corinne and Preston Hale, and when Judge Whitfield read her ruling, I didn't cry and I didn't smile either. I just sat very still, feeling something enormous and complicated settle over me, grief and vindication tangled together so tightly I couldn't have separated them if I'd tried. Denise sat 2 rows behind me with a different attorney than the one who'd represented her at the earlier hearings. I found out later she'd fired the first one after the search warrant results came in, and she didn't look at me once, not when the ruling was read, not when I stood up afterward and walked past her on my way out of the courtroom. She stared straight ahead, jaw tight, hands folded in her lap, and for the first time since that day in Preston Hale's office 8 months earlier, I saw fear on her face instead of calculation. The criminal case took another 5 months to reach trial, through the fall harvest and into the following winter, and I won't pretend those months were easy. Reinstating the will didn't undo the financial damage. Priya's audit, by the time it was finalized for the criminal proceedings, put the total theft at just over $310,000 across nearly 4 years, and while the civil suit would eventually recover a portion of that through liens on Denise's personal assets and a court-ordered restitution schedule, a significant portion of what had been stolen was simply gone, spent on things that left no trail worth chasing. Coal, Bishop's rent, expensive dinners, a boat he'd bought under yet another shell company that Doyle traced with a kind of grim satisfaction I'd come to recognize as his professional pride. Denise, Cole Bishop, and Garrett Voss were indicted in September on charges that included elder financial exploitation, forgery, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Voss, per his cooperation agreement, pleaded guilty in November to a reduced charge and received 18 months, most of which the judge suspended in exchange for his continued testimony and the surrender of his law license. Cole Bishop fought the charges initially, hiring an attorney with a reputation for dragging cases out, but the emails and the pattern Doyle had uncovered from his prior aliases in Florida and Alabama made his position increasingly indefensible, and he eventually pleaded guilty in January to avoid a trial that his own attorney reportedly told him he had almost no chance of winning. He received 4 years, with the possibility of parole after 2, and a restitution order that would follow him, Corinne assured me, for the rest of his working life. Denise was the only one who took her case to trial. I understand looking back why she did. Everyone else in that conspiracy had been protecting a business, a scheme, something transactional they could walk away from with enough negotiating and enough years served. Denise was protecting a story, the story that she genuinely loved my father, that she wasn't the kind of woman capable of what the evidence said she'd done, that somehow, despite the emails, despite the medication records, despite Garrett Voss's sworn testimony about that September meeting in her living room, there was still a version of events where she came out looking like something other than a woman who had systematically drained and deceived a dying man for 4 years. The trial lasted 6 days. I testified on the 3rd day, walking the jury through the will reading, through the whispered accusations of instability, through the moment in Preston Hale's office when I first understood something had gone terribly wrong. Denise's attorney, a sharp, aggressive man named Halvorsen who'd clearly been paid a great deal of money to salvage what he could, tried to paint me during cross-examination as an angry, entitled daughter who'd resented her stepmother from the start and manufactured a conspiracy narrative out of ordinary family conflict and normal estate planning decisions. I sat in that witness box and let him try, answering each question calmly, factually the way Corinne had coached me for weeks, because I understood by then that my composure was itself a piece of evidence. The woman Denise had spent 6 months describing to the town of Statesboro was not the woman sitting in that witness chair, answering every hostile question without raising her voice. Dr. Osei testified the same day, laying out the medication discrepancy with the same careful, professional concern he'd shown me in his office 8 months earlier. Ruth Okafor testified the following day about the handwriting analysis, methodical and unshakable under cross-examination in a way that made Halvorsen visibly frustrated by the end of it. Priya walked the jury through the financial trail with a series of exhibits so clear and so damning that I watched 2 jurors shaking their heads by the time she finished. And on the fifth day, Garrett Voss testified in person, describing that September meeting in Denise's living room in exact, unflinching detail. The way she'd coached my father through where to sign, the way she'd smiled and told Voss not to worry. Walton understood everything perfectly. Right before turning to my father and speaking to him, Voss testified, the way you might speak to a child who was having trouble following instructions. The jury deliberated for just under 5 hours. They found Denise guilty on all counts: elder financial exploitation, forgery, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Judge Whitfield, the same judge who'd overturned the will months earlier, presided over sentencing in February. I gave a victim impact statement, standing at a podium in a courtroom that had become strangely familiar to me over the past year, and I told the truth as plainly as I could. I told the court about a man who woke before dawn to walk rows of pecan trees, checking each one like he was counting his own children. I told them what it costs a person to lose a parent twice, once to death, and once to the slow, deliberate unmaking of everything you thought you knew about the last years of his life. I told them that Denise Calloway hadn't just stolen money. She'd stolen the ending of my father's story, replaced it with something smaller and crueler, and that no amount of restitution could ever give that back to me. Denise received 7 years, with eligibility for parole after 4, along with a restitution order covering her portion of the $310,000. She looked at me exactly once during sentencing, when the judge finished reading, and whatever I expected to see on her face, anger, defiance, even something like an apology, wasn't there. What I saw instead was something closer to confusion, like she genuinely could not understand how the quiet, grieving girl she'd spent 30 years underestimating had ended up standing on the other side of the courtroom, calm and unbroken, while she was the one being led away. Tripp was never charged criminally. The district attorney's office concluded, after reviewing the evidence, that he hadn't been meaningfully involved in the scheme itself, just a beneficiary of a title and salary that evaporated the moment the original will was reinstated. I heard, secondhand through Naomi, that he'd moved to Jacksonville within a few months of the sentencing, taking a sales job at a car dealership there, the same kind of work he'd failed at once before in Statesboro. I don't know if he's doing better this time. I've thought about reaching out to him more than once in quieter moments, wondering whether he was ever really a co-conspirator or just another person his mother used, the way she used my father, the way she used the whole town's sympathy for a grieving widow. But every time I've come close to picking up the phone, I've remembered that final text message, and I've put it back down. Some bridges I've come to accept are simply gone, and building new ones takes a willingness on both ends that I never saw any evidence of from him. I want to tell you that the moment the gavel came down at sentencing, I felt whole again. That's not quite true, and I think it's important to say so, because I think a lot of people expect revenge or justice, or whatever you want to call what I got, to feel like a door closing cleanly on a chapter of pain. It didn't feel like that. It felt like setting down something impossibly heavy that I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten what my body felt like without it. Relief, yes, enormous relief, but also a strange, hollow ache where all that fury used to live, because fury, it turns out, can become its own kind of company, and when it finally leaves you have to relearn how to be a person without it. What I did feel, walking out of that courthouse into a cold February afternoon with Naomi's arm looped through mine, was something closer to my father's voice than I'd heard in over a year. Not a literal voice. I don't believe in that kind of thing, not really, but a feeling, a certainty that somewhere in whatever comes after, he knew now. He knew what had been done to him, and he knew what I'd done to answer it, and some part of me, the part that had spent 28 years trying to be the daughter who made him proud, finally let that particular ache go quiet. The spring after the sentencing, I planted 11 new pecan trees along the northern edge of the property, in the section my father had always talked about expanding into, but never got around to before his first heart attack slowed him down. I did it myself, mostly with Naomi helping on weekends and a couple of seasonal hands doing the heavy digging, and I remember standing out there at the end of the first day, dirt under my fingernails, back aching in a way that felt earned instead of stolen, thinking that this was the first decision about this land I'd made purely because I wanted to, not because I was defending it, not because I was proving anything to anyone in a courtroom, or a small town full of people who'd once looked at me sideways. That's the part nobody tells you about a year like the one I'd had. You spend so long in defense, in evidence gathering, in careful, controlled composure, that when it's finally over, you almost don't know how to just live in the space that's left. For weeks after sentencing, I kept waiting for the next blow. a phone call from Corinne about an appeal, a knock on the door from someone connected to Cole Bishop looking for trouble, some fresh betrayal I hadn't accounted for. It took months to really understand, that the waiting was over. That I could plant 11 trees on a Tuesday in April simply because I loved the way pecan trees look in their first uncertain years. Thin and hopeful, nothing at all like the enormous, gnarled elders further down the rows that my great-great-grandfather had planted 140 years earlier. Naomi married her longtime boyfriend, Desmond, that June in a small ceremony at his family's church outside Statesboro, and she asked me to stand up with her, which undid me more than almost anything else that whole strange year had. I stood at the front of that church in a pale green dress, watching my oldest friend promise herself to someone who'd earned it, and I let myself cry the kind of tears I hadn't allowed since the funeral. Not grief this time, or not only grief, but something rounder and fuller than that, gratitude maybe, for a friend who'd sat with me in the back office of a farm store and told me the truth when it would have been easier to say nothing. I dated, eventually, though not right away. It took the better part of 2 years before I let anyone close enough to matter, and when I finally did, it was with a man named Sawyer Ridley, an agricultural equipment dealer from Vidalia who I met, unglamorously, over a dispute about a harvester part that turned into a 3-hour conversation and then slowly into something more. I told him the whole story early on. I'd decided, after everything, that I wasn't interested in being with anyone who couldn't handle the full weight of who I'd become because of what happened. And he listened without flinching, without the pity that used to make my skin crawl when well-meaning acquaintances found out. He asked good questions. He asked how I was doing now, not just what had happened then. And I think that's the difference between a person worth keeping and a person who's only interested in the drama of your worst year. Preston Hale retired the following spring, and at his retirement dinner, held in the same church fellowship hall where my father's funeral reception had been held years earlier, he pulled me aside and told me something I've carried with me ever since. Your daddy used to say you had a head for business, Emery, and that was true enough. But I watched you build a case against people who'd spent a year convincing an entire town you were the unstable one, and you never once let them make you into the person they said you were. That's not a head for business. That's character. Don't ever let anybody make you doubt you have it, no matter what else happens in your life. I think about that sentence more than almost anything else anyone said to me during those years, because it names something I struggled for a long time to name myself. The particular danger of being lied about by people who are counting on your own anger to eventually make the lie look true. Denise didn't just steal money and land. She built a trap where my fury, however justified, could have become the very evidence she needed to finish erasing me, if I'd let it. The hardest part of the entire ordeal wasn't the theft, or even the grief. It was staying calm enough, patient enough, controlled enough, to make sure that when the truth finally came out, it came out clean, undeniable, and entirely on my terms. I still visit my father's grave every October on the anniversary, and I still walk the rows at dawn more mornings than not, though these days it's less about grief and more about habit, the way some people run or pray or sit with coffee on a porch. Callaway Orchards turned its best year yet last season, nearly 11% above our previous record, and I've started talking with Naomi about opening a second farm store location outside Savannah, something my father used to dream about, but never had the capital or the trust in anyone else's judgment to attempt. I have both now. The capital came from 4 hard years of careful growth. The trust I built myself, one decision at a time, with people who'd earned it. Denise is still in prison as I tell you this. Her first parole hearing is scheduled for next year, and Corinne has already told me I'll have the chance to submit another statement if I want to, though I honestly don't know yet whether I will. Part of me wants to stand in that room one more time and remind whoever's deciding exactly what 4 years of careful, deliberate cruelty look like when you add up every invoice and every altered medication dose and every whispered lie about a grieving daughter's stability. Another part of me, the part that's finally slowly learning what peace feels like, wonders if I've already said everything I need to say, and whether showing up again would be less about justice and more about a fury I've mostly, finally, set down. I don't know yet which part of me will win when the time comes. Maybe I won't know until I'm standing in that hallway again, feeling the weight of the choice in my hands. What I do know is this. My father spent his whole life believing that the land you tend, the way you tend it, and the people you choose to build alongside are the truest measure of who you are. Not blood, not the name on a document, not what people say about you behind closed doors when they think you can't hear them. I used to think that was just something farmers said to make hard, unglamorous work sound meaningful. I understand it differently now. I understand that everything Denise took from me, the money, the reputation, the story of my father's final year, was never actually the thing she was after. What she wanted was for me to become small enough, doubted enough, discredited enough, that I'd simply hand over what was left without a fight. I didn't. And every tree I've planted since, every dawn I've walked those rows with dirt on my boots and my father's voice somewhere quiet in the back of my mind, is proof that patience, when it's paired with the truth, outlasts even the most carefully constructed lie. That's the whole of it. That's how I lost my father twice, and how I got him back, in the only way that was ever really possible, by refusing to let the people who betrayed him rewrite what he actually stood for. My name is Emery Calloway. This land has carried my family's name for 140 years, and it's going to carry it for 140 more, because I made sure of it, one quiet, unshakable decision at a time.